Welcome everyone, this is Honest Restart. This time I want to talk about the difference between open air and open world. What's the difference? Isn't Breath of the Wild an open world game? Well, according to Nintendo, it's not quite an open world game, it's something different, or at least they choose to define it a little bit differently. They define Breath of the Wild as an open air game. Now, considering this, what would the open air direction mean for the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, for the lack of a better term since there hasn't been an official name yet, Breath of the Wild 2? Well, that's what we're going to be focusing on in this video, the difference between open air and open world, and what that's going to mean for the sequel to Breath of the Wild. Now, before we jump into things, I want to quickly talk about my social media. There's a Twitter page, a Discord community, a Twitch channel, and a Patreon page. If you're interested in any of that, please check it out. It's all linked in the description below. In order to understand the difference between open world and open air, I think we first need to take a moment to find out what these actually mean. What is the definition of open world, and what is Nintendo's definition of open air? Now, open world is basically a game that has an open environment that you can go around freely and explore and progress seamlessly with no loading times. Open world games have actually been around for a very long time. You could define the original Legend of Zelda as an open world game. You were allowed to explore that game with a great deal of freedom and go out of order in many ways. Of course, there's a whole bunch of modern open world games as well, such as Grand Theft Auto, Red Dead Redemption, Skyrim, Horizon Zero Dawn, the list goes on. But when Nintendo finally showed off The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, Miyamoto said that he didn't want to call it an open world game. And many found that to be really weird because, well, from everything we had seen, the game appeared to be quite open and vast. And Miyamoto's point wasn't to say that the game wasn't an open world game, but what I think Miyamoto was trying to convey at the time was that Nintendo didn't want to limit Breath of the Wild to the open world idea. They wanted to go beyond that and do more. So I'm going to go ahead and read this quote from Miyamoto. I think within the game industry or the tech industry, there's a tendency to want to name everything. But I think it's important for what we do that we don't want to be dependent or swayed by the technology and what's available now. We want to use the technology and the techniques that are available to make what we want to make. What's important is to really express how we use that to make our experience unique. We didn't just want to make a game where you can do anything, but we wanted to make sure that we make a game where the player is able to do anything, but it's also a form of entertainment. It's fun to do all of those things. That's why we felt that coming up with a name that we created would be best. The term open air is a result of that. So from here, I feel like it's being implied that the traditional open world style of gameplay for a lot of games, such as your Skyrims, your Horizon Zero Dawns, weren't as fun as they could potentially be, and the Zelda team was trying to push Zelda to be beyond that, to be beyond your typical open world game. And of course, in hindsight, I think many of us would agree that they did just that. Going back to other open world games now doesn't really feel too great. It feels limiting. Those games have a lot more barriers, the worlds are not nearly as interactive, and they leave a lot to be desired compared to Breath of the Wild. This is what Bill Trinen had to say on Nintendo's decision to use open air to describe the game. From my perspective, I look at a lot of open world games, and the world is a setting for the story the developers want to tell in that space. I look at this game, Breath of the Wild, and I see a world that is fully integrated into the exploration and the adventure. It's not just a world that you are passing through, it's a sort of world that you are part of. So much of the adventure and exploration is in this outdoor space, and the theme of wilderness collectively seemed like open air was the right fit for it. So I can understand why some people may have some confusion between the difference of open air versus open world, because the way Nintendo is defining it, you could interpret it as them simply saying that their version of open world is better than other open world, and I kind of think that's, at a very basic level, what they were trying to get at. With Breath of the Wild, Nintendo was trying to do away with those limitations you feel while playing other games. And actually this came from Onuma in reference to Ocarina of Time and also speaking on the open air concept for Breath of the Wild. At that time, I thought that was the right thing. However, as we stacked on the series, not getting lost would produce feelings of blockages like cannot do anything but that or cannot run away. So more and more people felt dissatisfied with that. I think the point that's trying to be made here is that looking at previous Zelda games, there was a lot of limitations in terms of what you can do and when you could do it, and they did away with all of that in Breath of the Wild, or at least as much as they could, thus the open air concept. It's a world that is fully interactive and is done in a very fun way. Nintendo continually worked on the physics engine and the amount of things you can interact with in the world and do so many different things. The interactivity of the world is more than any other game. But I think it goes beyond just the near infinite amount of possibilities that can be accomplished through the physics system and the battle engine and such, but also in the way you explore the world. It's not just going from one point to another on an X and Y axis, there's also a Z axis here. The verticality in Breath of the Wild sort of trumps most other open world games. Take Skyrim for example. Sure, you can technically climb the mountains, but for the most part, mountains and trees sort of act as a barrier for your exploration. And then other open world games such as Horizon Zero Dawn don't even allow you to traverse mountains at all. They simply are a barrier. But then take a look at Breath of the Wild. Mountains are essentially giant platforms in Breath of the Wild, and if you know what you're doing, you can find ways to go beyond the mountains, to go high up in the sky, fly with the dragons. There is so much you can do. But to sum up everything I'm referring to here, basically open world, the way I think it should be defined, is a giant environment that you can explore seamlessly with no loading times, and you can explore it freely and do what you want. But with open air, it takes it to another level. It's basically enhanced open world where you can interact with the world in a myriad of different ways, and you feel like there's a lot more sense of freedom. The barriers you tend to see in other games, Breath of the Wild's goal was to do away with as many barriers as possible and to create more and more ways to interact with the world. So bearing that in mind, this open air concept, what would this mean for the sequel to Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild? Aonuma already told us that Breath of the Wild 1 would not be the last open air game. They are going to continue in this direction. And for a while, I've been saying on this channel, if you've been following me, that Breath of the Wild 2 is a great opportunity for Nintendo to take the open air concept to another level. Consider this for a moment. Breath of the Wild was the first fully fledged open world Zelda game for the modern era, and they hit it out of the park. It is one of the highest rated games of all time. It is the best selling Zelda game of all time. It's very, very good. It set a new standard for open games. It's an evolution of open world game. It's an open air game as Nintendo would define it. But as I said, this was Nintendo's first attempt at the open air style with Zelda. What will happen when they've done it again, when they've had some time to master this style? They could accomplish so much more. They're going to enhance the physics engine, create more ways to manipulate and interact with the world, and expand upon the open air concept. When you take a look at the sequel trailer for Breath of the Wild, there seems to be quite a focus on exploration underground. I think, sure, we're going to be returning to Hyrule, that's already been confirmed by Aonuma, but we're going to have to do more in this version of Hyrule. There's going to be a lot of changes in order for it to feel like a fresh new game if we're going to be playing in the same environment. Many changes. Some of those changes will be with the world we explored previously. There could be a lot of geographical changes with earthquakes and things of that nature, and rebuilding of civilizations and towns, like things like that for sure. But I also think there's going to be a lot of exploration underground. We see it in the trailer, and when you take a look at the final shot of the trailer, we don't see any Sheikah shrines or towers or anything like that. So for this game, what sort of dungeons will there be if all the Sheikah shrines and towers have receded back into the ground? Well, if we are exploring underground, we may interact with them underground, but also, perhaps, we will find actual dungeons. The map for Breath of the Wild has all sorts of locales and areas throughout the entire history of Hyrule, but all the classic temples and dungeons that we've seen throughout the history of Legend of Zelda were mysteriously missing in this map, even though it included pretty much everything else. Where are they? Maybe since Breath of the Wild takes place so much further in the timeline, all these classical temples and dungeons are simply underground since so much time has passed, but with the events of Breath of the Wild 2, with Ganondorf awakening and causing the castle to rise up and there being this giant earthquake, perhaps some of these temples and dungeons will be unearthed, or perhaps some of these other temples and dungeons will be found by exploration underground. The point I'm trying to make here is really that I think Nintendo is going to evolve the open air concept and give us more range of exploration here. They're really going to expand upon that Z axis in terms of verticality, how high we can go and how low we can go. But I don't think Nintendo's going to be focusing on going underground, but also underwater as well. We've seen all sorts of beautiful things under the water for Breath of the Wild, but really considering how open the game is, we weren't able to really explore that much of the water. Why weren't we able to dive underwater and see what was there? I think there's a lot more room for growth here, and considering they're going to be returning to Hyrule, they're going to have a lot more time and opportunity to develop a lot more areas underwater and I think we will actually be able to explore underwater this time around. It's something that's been done in previous Zelda games. Considering that you can do so much more than any previous Zelda game in Breath of the Wild, I think it's weird that one of the few things Breath of the Wild can't do is something that we've seen in multiple other Zelda games, and that's exploring underwater. So for sure, I think that will be a big part of expanding the open air concept in Breath of the Wild too. And while we're still on the topic of expanding the Z-axis in Breath of the Wild 2, what of the sky? Sure, we could explore a great deal of the sky in Breath of the Wild, but there weren't too many worlds to explore in the sky. There was no sky town, there was no city in the sky or dungeon in the sky like in Skyward Sword or Twilight Princess. What if they were to bring these areas back, or areas like it? I do think there's actually a hint towards that from what we've seen in the DLC. So we know that a lot of the ideas for Breath of the Wild 2 are taken from DLC ideas that Nintendo was working on, and when we take a look at the first pack of the DLC that included Master Mode, in Master Mode, there's a lot of additional platforms added all throughout the world of Hyrule, and these platforms were in the air in places that were very hard to reach. It forced you to sort of rethink how you could explore the air in Breath of the Wild. I think this component of Master Mode could be a hint towards where the development team is headed in their thinking in terms of expanding the open air concept, giving us more ways to explore the world we already have. As we discussed earlier in the video, the open air concept is more than just the scope of what you explore, but also how you explore the world in meaningful ways. There's so much you can do with Breath of the Wild with hunting and cooking and using the different runes and taking advantage of the physics by throwing boulders and fire and using wind, all things of that nature, sure, but imagine how much more we're going to be able to do once you give the Zelda team a few more years to tinker with the physics system and the world of Hyrule, and just doing more and stacking things on top of that and adding even more ways to interact with the world. And really what I think they're going to be focusing on is trying to find other ways to limit barriers. But what other barriers could there be? Well, there's a few depending on how you choose to define a barrier. The barrier of the ground, that I think could be arguably a barrier, and we've seen some evidence suggesting Nintendo will go underground. The barrier swimming underwater, perhaps Nintendo could do that as well. But also, what about weapons and durability? How is that a barrier? Well, I mean in terms of the limitation of not having your weapons for as long as you want. Maybe they could do more with that. Maybe they will add crafting this time around. Maybe when you break a weapon, instead of the weapon breaking into a whole bunch of little particles and never seeing it again, maybe you can collect the scraps and use that to rebuild or recraft a new weapon. Another limitation I could see them sort of doing away with is the limitation of NPCs. Maybe they will work on the NPCs and give you more ways to interact with them. Maybe you could push them around. Maybe you can play with them. Maybe you can pet dogs in Breath of the Wild too. I think these are things that may become options. I think Nintendo is going to continue to develop this open air concept and expand upon it and really work on breaking down the limitations that we even saw in Breath of the Wild, which already had far less limitations than previous open world games. I may very well just be scratching the surface here in terms of what expanding upon the open air concept could mean for the sequel to Breath of the Wild, so I invite you guys to give me your own ideas of what this could mean in the comments below. Let me know, I'm really curious. But anyways everyone, this is On Just Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching. I'm excited about this open air concept and what else Nintendo could do with it. I think this premise of them breaking down barriers and limitations is very exciting. Breath of the Wild was one of the most liberating, if not the most liberating game I've ever played, and the sequel might expand upon that and make it an even better experience, and I think that is very exciting. But that's all for now, everyone. Thank you so much. I'll see you all really soon. Take care.